How far would you go to escape an abusive partner? Once, she loved him with every inch of her body, but he tormented her, abused her, then cast her aside. Fueled by rage, she and her friends lured him, bound him, and began a ritual they found on YouTube. He woke too soon, screaming, "I see you, you witches!" So she drove rusty scissors into his eyes and tore out his tongue. They laughed as they destroyed him, then dumped his broken body in the river and slept soundly. But the next morning, she felt his burning soul upon her shoulders, and it will haunt her until the day she dies. Join the community for more stories. His heavy corpse clings to her back like an undesirable cloak, his rotting flesh melting into her pores, molding itself to her structure. She used to be able to peel his skin away with her fingertips, but now she must use a pair of blunt scissors she carries in her purse. She need only leave it an hour after flaying his blackened tissue from her own, and his body has already begun merging itself with hers again. It's the smell that gets to her most, being cocooned in a cloud of rotting meat that can make one feel quite mad. She'll catch a glimpse of him sometimes in the mirror. She'll see his gaunt face appear as if resting atop her shoulders, almost cradling neatly into her neck. The sockets that once encased his big brown eyes are now empty, with trails of anorexic veins pouring out from them and onto his cheeks. His mouth never closes. Forever will his jaw hang open. If she looks closely enough, she can see the bones in the jaw and the inside of his mouth that were violently torn apart from one another. He has no tongue. They dealt with that well. His hair still retains a chestnut hue, yet big clumps are missing and maggots have begun to feed away, and it festered the skin. They managed to permeate the skin with their tiny little fangs and will soon reach his fetid brain. He groans in her ear at night while she tries to sleep. She can feel his cold breath etching its way up from her neck to her ears. He never speaks. He only laments the most guttural sounds of great distress. She knew at the time that what she and her friends were doing was risky and could get them in prison. But now prison sounds like paradise compared to the hell she's living in. She did love the boy once, with every inch of her body. Just the thought of him would have her stomach overcrowded with butterflies. Whenever he would call her name, brush his hand against hers, or simply smile at her, she felt completely faint from giddiness. The boy loved her too, in his own way. He could be kind, but he could also be cruel. One day, the boy began kicking her after she was crying too loudly after an argument they had had. Other days, he would ignore her and taunt himself, flirting overly with other women in front of her face. He drove the girl quite mad, but nonetheless, she still loved him. One day, he left her. The boy broke up with her at his house, and he couldn't be in a relationship anymore, and that it was all too much for him. When the girl declined the breakup, he screamed a tirade of vulgar words into her frightened face about how much of a bad girlfriend she had been to him. He spat out his last insult and then left her to weep into his pillow. Once she had howled out all of the built-up hurt, the girl's despair turned into a red-hot rage. That rage was then transferred to her friends after she told them all of the savage things he would do and say to her whilst they'd been together. Secrets she'd been keeping for the sheer embarrassment it caused her. In detail, she described the wicked ways in which he would torture and abuse her. Thus a plan was formed. They were to spike the boy's drink whilst he was at the club, and would take him back to whoever's house was free that night. Once there, they would pluck out 3 strands of his hair, a clipping of a fingernail, a tear from the tear duct of his right eye, and spittle from his tongue. The plan was set afoot after the three friends found a YouTube video on how to create your own voodoo doll for anyone you wished to taunt. Simple, they all thought. Yet he woke far sooner than expected. The moment the three of them lay his heavy body on the carpet of one of their living rooms, he began murmuring and his eyelids started twitching beneath the scarf they had tied around his head. The girls stood over him in a circle and watched in silence as their plan unfolded. He started wriggling and writhing so much that the movement caused his blindfold to fall down from his eyes. "Quick, grab him!" one of the girl's friends shouted to the other. And so he was grabbed by his scalp. She yanked his head hard back to the ground. Blood started to seep into her nails. His fists started pounding the floor beneath him. "He's going to scream! He's gonna scream!" shouted one of them. The girl who had been holding down his head jumped up and landed both feet onto one of the boy's arms. Her friends followed suit. "I see you, you witches! God is my witness, I will kill you for this!" He bellows into the face of his ex-lover, who was now standing with legs either side of his torso, smirking. Why would he say that he had seen them? She pulls out a pair of rusty scissors from her back pocket and lunges for the boy's face. She rams the tip of the blades into the center of his pupils, stabbing them over and over. The boy wails a cry so painful she flinches and stops what she's doing. She looks up at the other girls for a sign of what to do next. They're both looking right back into her eyes, giggling. So she continues her tyranny of pain in the left eye. The mutilation of the boy has begun, and now the girls have tasted blood. It's impossible for them to stop. His screaming is little deterred by the lack of sight, so with the same scissors the girl tears out his tongue, the blunt blade doing its best to shred through his gamey muscle, a muscle that threw so many heinous insults at her. The boy started choking on the blood that's gushing out of his tongue and clogged up his airways, and all the girls could do was cry with laughter. An hour goes by and the boy's body is blackened and blue. What once was a vessel for a mind that yearned for life, now a mere carcass with hanging entrails from all its crevices. Swiftly and composed, the girls dispose of the body in the nearby river and clean themselves off. That night they all sleep soundly in their warm beds, the scent of copper on them all simply acting as an aid to their deep slumber. It's only when she wakes does the girl have a sense of regret. She recognizes the anger that now sits upon her shoulders, and it shall sit there until the day she dies. One story down, 4 more to go. Can you make it through all of them? But if you enjoy the storytelling, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. It helps us tremendously, and it might protect you from the things that go bump in the night. The shadow figure stepped into the light of the moon, and it took all my will to stifle my scream. What emerged into the clearing was a monster. Her body was made of wood and rotting bark. She had truly become one with the forest. She strode towards Sean and gently stroked a claw down his face. Mira reached and pulled one of the bulbish boils from her skin. Before he could react, she shoved the bulb down his throat. His body expanded and his arms turned into mighty branches. His human features ceased to exist, and all that stood before me was a fresh birch tree. She then turned those amber eyes on me, and all sane thoughts left my body. Join the community for more stories. A lot of questions have been asked of me lately, but by many different parties. My parents want to know why I almost refuse to leave the house anymore. My doctor wants to know what has been causing my insomnia. The police want to know my whereabouts and actions on the night of the 20th. However, the hardest question to answer are the questions my friends' parents keep asking. They ask in different ways, but it always amounts to the same thing. Where is my child? That question is difficult, not because I don't know the answer, but because I do. I could tell them almost exactly where they can find their children, but the problem is, they won't believe a word of it. Even if they did, the stark truth of it all would destroy them. It is better to have a fraction of hope than to know the horrors of reality. Then why am I writing this? Perhaps it is my own guilt that forces the pen to the paper. The truth deserves to be told in some form, so I write this once, so that I never have to speak of this aloud. It all began, as the police expect, on the 20th of March. I got a text from my friend Sean saying that since it was the end of spring break, we should all go camping in the woods. Camping in early spring is not the activity I would have had in mind, but Sean was our unofficial leader, and once he got his mind set on something, it was hard to say no to him. Besides, he had been dealing with sickness problems for the last few weeks, and he really needed time out. That night, the four of us met at the entrance of Rama Woods. Sean had got there first with his girlfriend Callie. She was a beautiful woman with baby blue eyes and bright blonde hair. One look at her and you would assume she was your typical airhead mean girl. However, she was anything but that. I have never met a kinder woman, and she was top of her class at Brock University. She had a glorious future ahead of her. At least she used to. What she was doing with a man like Sean, I'll never know. He was kind, but very arrogant and self-centered. Definitely the daredevil type that knew no fear. Last to arrive was Andrew. One look at him would have you assuming that he was your standard stoner, slacker, and you would be right. You could even add philosopher and conspiracy theorist to that list as well. He was the only one of us not in university. He claims that post-secondary education is just the government's way of keeping the poor in low-end jobs. He came up and we high-fived each other. Had I known that he had less than 4 hours to live, I would have gone with a hug. We hiked into the woods and managed to get our camp set up just before the sun went down. We all sat in a circle around the campfire when Andrew asked the question that had been on all our minds. What did you really bring us out here for, man? If you wanted to get drunk, we could have done that back at your place. What's your plan? Lead us into the woods and kill us all one by one? Sean just laughed at this. Not exactly. You guys know what day it is? He asked. I merely shrugged. It's the first night of spring, he said, as if that explained everything. Yeah, it might be spring, but this is still Canada. There's still snow on the ground, not 10 feet from us, Andrew complained. Callie rubbed Sean's shoulder. I'm with him. You were going to put yourself right back into the hospital, baby. Sean just smiled again. I'm never going back to the hospital again. Not after tonight. None of us are, he said with absolute certainty. We all looked at him in confusion. Tonight, we will be performing The Blessing of Mira. Sean yelled like a sports announcer. Andrew and I rolled our eyes, but Callie seemed confused. What are you talking about? She asked. Sean rubbed her back and kissed her head. Don't worry, baby. Sometimes I forget you are not a local. In your months here, has no one told you the legend of Mira Birch? Callie merely shook her head. Gather around, children, and I shall weave you a tale, Sean said with a mischievous grin. We sat in silence while Sean recited the legend that we had all been hearing since middle school. Centuries ago, in these very woods, lived a woman named Mira Birch. Some called her a green witch. Some say she was simply a woman who lived in the forest. She lived in a small cabin at the heart of the woods. She's spent her days in harmony with nature, tending to the trees and plants of the forest. However, her peaceful existence was threatened when the lumberjacks arrived. Seemingly at the moment of lumberjacks, a loud crack sounded through the air. A chill went through our spines, but we continued to listen. Mira confronted the woodsman and told them to leave her woods unharmed or disaster would befall them. The men laughed it off, however. After that day, a curse seemed to take hold of them. Some of the men came down with a deadly flu. One man was crushed when a tree fell in a way that completely defied all logic. Their foreman said it was a simple misfortune, but the men knew it was a witch's curse. That night, while Mira was sleeping, the men traveled to her cabin, then sealed the doors and windows. They lit her cabin ablaze and listened while she screamed inside. With their foe gone, the men continued to work uninterrupted. They had nearly destroyed the forest until one morning the men did not show up to work. The foreman went to their camp, and what he found was complete desolation. The men had all been torn apart, their axes broken, and sticking out of their chests were long tree branches. They say that the spirit of Mira still lingers to this day, protecting the forest from that which would harm it. On quiet nights, you can still hear her angry screams on the wind. Andrew shook his head. No, I thought it was if you heard a familiar voice in the wind, turn around and run as fast as you can. John shrugged. There's so many legends of Mira, ranging from the very peaceful to her being pure evil. That story is the one I feel is the most accurate, Sean said strongly. Surely you don't believe any of it, I said, exasperated. Sean shook his head. The burnt cabin exists, that much is fact. That is where we are going tonight. Why would we do that? Callie asked. Sean reached into his bag and pulled out 4 tree saplings. We're gonna complete the blessing of Mira. It is said that if you venture to her cabin and leave a sapling on her floor to honor her, then you will be blessed with health and longevity. Andrew shook his head again. Do you really believe these old wives' tales? Sean shrugged. Well, I say we do it regardless. If it works, then great. If not, then we all have a good laugh and get drunk. What do we have to lose? None of us could really think of a good argument to that, so we simply nodded and got ready. Turns out we had everything to lose. Sean put out the fire and placed a sapling into each of our palms. Remember, you need to have positive thoughts at all times during the ritual, he told us with full seriousness. Can do, Andrew muttered through the side of his mouth that didn't have a lit joint in it. You're seriously going to smoke that while we do this? Sean asked, clearly annoyed. Well, it is a gift from the earth. It would be disrespectful to deny it, Andrew retorted. Sean merely nodded. Fair enough. Now, make sure that you stick to the trail at all times. Most important of all, do not do anything to disturb or harm the forest. You will live to regret it. With that, we set out on our journey. None of us spoke on the walk through the woods. I'm not sure if it was out of fear or respect, but none of us dared to make a sound. I tried to manifest as many positive thoughts as I could, but I could not deny that the woods were creeping me out. Every tree branch looked like clawed fingers reaching for me. The wind blew the budding leaves in the trees, and the sound was like the rattle of a snake. All through the trees, crows and owls sat on branches, seemingly watching our progress. Finally, we made it to the bottom of the hill, and what we found stole the breath from our lungs. Laying before us were the charred remains of a cabin. The wood was burnt and rotting in places, but the frame and roof remained intact. I don't know how to describe it, but I could feel the fear and pain Mira must have felt in her final moments. Based on the expression of the others, they did as well. The only one unaffected was Sean, who had a big grin on his face. Sean walked through a gaping hole in the wall and into the cabin. We followed suit, but with much more caution. Once we were all in, Sean turned to us and smiled. "This is it. All you have to do is place your sapling down and say the following incantation. O great mother, we implore you to grant us your blessing. We honor your sacrifice and offer you our nobility." We simply nodded, and one by one we completed the ritual. For some strange reason that I couldn't identify at the time, when I finished the incantation, I felt a sense of dread instead of peace. We all completed the ritual, and once we did, a strange and ominous wind rushed past us and chilled the room. Then it stopped, and we were left with silence. We stood for a few minutes, but nothing seemed to happen. Andrew grew agitated. "We came all the way out here for this? What a massive waste of time." He took out his joint, and before any of us could react, he flicked it at his sapling. When the lit joint hit the tree, I could feel a strange ripple rush through the room, and I had the strangest sensation that we were not alone. "What have you done?" Sean asked. We all turned to Andrew, however none of us were prepared for what we saw. In the dark gloom of the cabin, a strange black silhouette stood behind Andrew. Before we had a chance to warn him, a clawed hand reached around and swiped at his neck. Andrew gasped and tried to grasp his throat. However, it was quickly turned to ash. The tears in his throat traveled down his neck and into his lungs. His chest started to dissolve into nothing but burnt ash, and at last he collapsed to the floor and his body fell. The figure in the shadows stood in his wake. A pair of amber eyes glowed in the darkness. They stared at us in hatred. None of us wasted any time lingering. We all rushed out of the cabin. We dared not look back, but we could hear a mighty roar from the cabin, followed by a churning of wood. It was coming for us. We ran as fast as we could, just praying not to get lost in the woods. Finally, we couldn't run anymore and collapsed in a clearing. Sean sat on a rock and looked shell-shocked. "I told him not to upset nature! I warned him he would regret it!" Callie shook her head. "Are you saying that thing was really a witch?" I thought of joining her protests, but I just couldn't. I saw one of my best friends turn to ash before my eyes. I am a rational person, but there is a fine line between being rational and being in denial. "Yes, I believe that is what that was," I said, trying to stay calm. Tears flowed from her eyes. "What do we do then?" she asked. "I say we make our way back to camp with our cars and get out of here," I yelled. Sean looked uncertain for a moment, but then nodded his head. "Let's go, and for the love of all that you hold dear, stick together." We walked through the forest quickly but quietly as we dared. Our ears were on high alert. I swear I could hear every gust of wind, every blade of grass that moved. We walked on, but something was wrong. The walk to the cabin had been relatively short, and we had walked almost twice that long back. I walked to Sean. We should have hit the camp long ago," I said. Sean didn't turn to face me, but nodded his head. "She doesn't want us to leave," he said with surprising calm. I was about to protest when the squeak of Callie's voice sounded behind us. "Guys, I can't move!" We turned towards her and saw her frozen in fear. I was confused, so I pulled my flashlight out and shined it on her. I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sight. At her feet were dozens of bugs, spiders, and snakes, predators and prey standing side by side, only focused on Callie. They reared their heads and legs at her aggressively. Sean moved forward and extended his hand to her. "Move forward. If you have no fear, they won't hurt you. I will protect you." She shook her head and said she couldn't. From behind her, those burning amber eyes shone in the dark. We yelled for her to move, but a long tentacle-like vine wrapped around her waist. With one mighty tug, she was dragged into the night. I still hear her ear-splitting scream every time I try to sleep. We knew there was no hope for her and ran as fast as we could. We found a small cave and hid inside. Sean began to cough uncontrollably. I tried to comfort him, but he pushed me away. He slowly stopped, and I saw a trail of blood coming from his mouth. I'm so sorry. I didn't want it to be like this. I thought it would be different, he said with tears in his eyes. I was about to ask him what he was talking about when a voice from the distance startled us. Callie's voice echoed from down the hill. Sean, where are you? I'm hurt and I need help. Please come. Why did you leave me? Sean began to cry and kept repeating that he was sorry. All is forgiven. Just please come help me, she cried. Sean got up and started running towards the voice. Something felt wrong here. The voice sounded like Callie, but there was something underneath it all, something sinister. I suddenly remembered the legend speaking of a familiar voice in the wind, and I ran out to him. The sounds of Sean crying filled the air. I followed them into a small clearing. Sean was on his knees in front of the trees where an all too familiar pair of amber eyes shone in the dark. Callie was hanging limply from a tree, both arms pierced with branches. Sean looked up at the dark witch. Please, I completed the ritual. I provided the sacrifices. Now give me what is promised. My jaw hung open and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My best friend was trying to have me killed? I'm not long for this world. My body is failing. But I'm not ready to die. Please, I'm begging you, fulfill the blessing. Grant me health and longevity. I beg you, please. He screamed into the darkness. The shadow figure stepped into the light of the moon, and it took all my will to stifle my scream. I don't know entirely what I was expecting. A weathered crone, burnt flesh, perhaps the ghost of a beautiful woman. However, what stepped out was not a ghost, nor was it human. What stepped into the clearing was a monster. Her body was made of wood and rotting bark. She bore long clawed fingers. Her body was covered in leaves oozing black sludge and small buds that looked like boils. Her hair was made of leaves of poison oak, and her mouth was full of stone fangs. She had truly become one with the forest. She strode towards Sean and gently stroked a claw down his face. Granted, she said with a dozen voices overlapping. Sean cried harder. Thank you, my lady, thank you. Mira reached and pulled one of the bulbish boils from her skin. Before he had time to react, she shoved the bulb down his throat. Sean grunted and struggled but could not stop her. She let him fall to the ground and he turned to face me. I'm so sorry, he said, crying his final tears. What happened next will be forever etched on my memory. Sean began to convulse and scream. Slowly his body began to lengthen and twist. His skin grew hard and turned into wood. His legs swelled as they stretched into great roots. They dug into the ground, forcing him to stand upright. His body expanded and his arms turned to mighty branches. His human features ceased to exist, and all that stood before me was a fresh birch tree. Mira put her hands upon it and said, Live long and grow in health. Sean's wish had indeed been granted. She then turned those amber eyes on me, and all sane thoughts left my body. I turned on my heels and ran. I didn't care about my friends anymore. All I cared about was the monster on my tail, and I could hear that she was gaining ground. I rushed past row after row of trees, and I couldn't help but wonder how many used to be people. I saw something in the distance that made my heart skip a beat. The road ahead, and I could see our cars packed on the side. I ran with all my might, all the while praying that I didn't trip on a rude ice. I placed my left foot on the cool pavement, and at the same moment I felt a set of razor-sharp claws rip into my right side. I screamed and fell to the ground. I waited for my skin to vanish or mutate, but nothing happened. I looked up and saw no pursuer in the trees. I was alone. I didn't know what else to do, so I left. The next day, the police came to me saying that they found my friends' cars at the side of the road, and they thought they knew through Facebook that we were getting together. I told them that I had changed my mind and stayed home. They drilled into me for days about their absence and told me I should come clean. However, we both knew they had no real evidence, and so they have stopped for now. In the days since I've become a recluse, I don't like to leave the house, and sleep is next to impossible. I tried to convince myself that perhaps the whole thing was some sort of hallucination brought on by stress. However, after last night, I no longer believe that to be possible. I wanted to face my fears, so I thought I would try exposure therapy. I went to the park near my house after dark. I stood in the darkness, and yet I felt nothing but calmness. That was until I heard the bark on the tree begin to rip. I turned towards it and my blood stopped. Standing there next to the tree was Mira, her amber eyes burning into me. She pointed a clawed finger at me, and the wound on my side burned as if it was fresh. She spoke then with the voice of my 3 fallen friends. "We're always watching you." Who is left after humanity's darkest evils devour the innocent? Sister Claire, the gentle nun with a smile like concentrated sunbeams, a balm against the coming hell, but the darkness claimed her, violated, devoured, lost to the void. Then she returned, bloated, twisted, her teeth grinding with unholy hunger. She lunged, jaws unhinging like an anaconda, swallowing a child whole amid cracking bones and desperate screams. She had tried to save us all, absorbing the world's sin into herself. Final martyrdom that shattered her soul. Join the community for more stories. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. Lord Byron. I had a dream in young childhood, and in this dream I saw the myriad evils of man. Terrorism, murder, rape, violent bigotry, and the scathing hatred that 1,000 years or so of the antiseptic morality could never wash away. I had a dream of darkness, but I saw a light. She was pure, she was good, Sister Claire of the Carmelite order, whom I had known as a teacher in a Catholic boarding school. Hill, maybe, I believe, West Hill? Sister Claire, whose glance never reprimanded but straightened, and whose gentle touch was a balm against Satan. So peculiarly clever that was this sister, so bewitchingly animated and animating in her lectures and sermons, that many of the students and even some fellow sisters, though never to her face, had taken calling her Uncanny Claire. I will observe a rule of writers when I say that it usually does not do good to write of a character who is all good and all rosy, no thorns and no flaws, but I think I am exempt from this insofar as I am recounting a dream, and to add flaws where there were none would be only to tarnish a true recounting, so far as I can manage with invention. Let therefore that observation be sufficient in taking in her likeness, for a rebel to the rule she was, and my conception of her was only such as a very young child she could conceive of a mother. What she looked like I cannot exactly recall. I have an image of what I like to think she looked like, of a fair, thin woman with blue eyes, and except I also gave her waves of blonde hair, innocent in the fact that when a sister became a novitite, she sacrificed not only the sentimental but her hair as well. Or perhaps, for something recommends me to also find white dress nothing in the way of aesthetics. The image was merely what she had looked like before joining. I daren't commit to this image, though, and the reader is at liberty to imagine her however they will, as long as what they see is beautiful. I remember her smile, like concentrated sunbeams, but beneath this glowing veneer, and in moments she thought no one was looking, I saw such a look of fear and sadness on her face, a look in equal measures ruining and ruthful, for a world filled with screams and sirens, for a world become hell. And sometimes I heard her crying to herself, but whenever she became aware of it, bravely, she would wipe her tears away with a laugh and give for consolidation with a firm conviction words, if not these, to this effect: "There now, God's in his heaven, and all is right in the world." Then she would proceed in her duties with the determinedly calm air of a martyr. But whenever she stopped to look outside to a world in its autumn, at a sky a perpetual red, I could see she was unsolaced. Looking back, I should have known that she was about to do something, but I contend no one could have anticipated what she was imminent in accomplishing and in failing to achieve. One day, she just disappeared, and when I asked the other sisters who taught there where she was, none of them seemed to know. If memory is not inexorably entangled with fancy, I visited her office where she privately tutored the children struggling in her class, or took students such as myself to have lunch hall, purloin, cookies, and milk with her, and where I verily believe she had once hugged me when I cried for some forgotten reason, perhaps because I missed my mother, or perhaps because what had happened to her, the sort of thing that was happening everywhere, scared me so badly because I might be next. She had been one of the first to die. I remember my father taking me into the living room and telling me that they had found her. He told me as calmly as he could to sit down. I remember the shocked, emotionless way he said it, the way an automaton might speak, hollowed and unaffected, unable to process his own words. He told me that they had found her body in an iron ore mill, violated and partially eaten, stuffed inside the throat of a garbage chute, but the authorities were soon overwhelmed, and ultimately no one was ever caught for it. Unable to endure it, a year, 3 months, and 2 weeks thereafter, my father had run off, abandoned me to die. Sister Claire had taken me to her breast and comforted me. My mother, she promised on her soul, was in a better place and looking down on me. And no matter where I was never alone, because my mother's spirit was with me and would always protect me. And here we were safe. Here, in one of the country's last refuges for children of damnation. She promised me something like that couldn't happen. In this room, she had a vast library filled with the religious and the occult, which I expect far exceeded the purview of Christianity. But in her genius, I expect she detected something, some seed of truth in these texts. Easily have reconciled them into biblical interpretation and the basic tenets of her philosophy. With the providence of latter-day knowledge, I expect, though I did not know of it, and one of these books and treatises was Zosimos of Panopolis's Visions, wherein he discoursed on Soma and Mnomia and the thereby obtainable philosopher's stone. Another, some Semitic treatise on the Ozel, the goat, or some Greek tome in the nature of the preparation of pharmatox, which involved human sacrifice. I expect more centrally located, perhaps just above her desk, now desolate of its personage, was a large crucifix. Let these things be sufficient clues for deciphering the mad experiment of Sister Claire. For about a week, or was it a month, she came back, but she was not the same. She was, at the time I thought her fat. Now, looking back, I am sure that she was instead bloated, her hair grown out, had turned black or brown, and as dry and weary as straw. Her fingernails, too, had grown out with bluish tint, and as though through plastic surgery she had developed a crook nose. Last, and though this verges on the stereotypical, I think I remember her holding a rotting apple in her hand. I think now I should not have recognized her, save for the faint and occasional omniscience of the dream world. Worst, As she sat on her desk before the class, she kept grinding her teeth loudly and wheezing, and her stomach kept groaning as though extreme hunger. I seem to recall one girl hesitantly raised her hand and asking, Sister? No doubt wondering when class was to begin. The screech of wooden legs against floor filled the room as Sister Claire pushed her chair backwards, as though to get up, but she remained seating, averting her eyes from us, muttering to herself. I could have sworn that I heard her whimper and then in a raspy tone curse us furiously under her breath. I maintain to this day that there grew some sort of electrostatic charge in the air, but we did not look at each other. Some instinctual urge not to move or speak held us. I will say that the students became hyper-aware of each other, and then she spoke again. Sister Claire? At the sound of her voice, Sister Claire's eyes darted. She shot up from her seat. Racing to the child, she had thrown herself to the ground and started licking her feet. With sickening pops, her mouth opened impossibly wide, like some great anaconda. Then there was an outline of frantic legs on the skin of her neck as she began to swallow the girl whole. She began to bite and chew her legs, bone cracking under tooth, skin, meat shredding. Screams became a horribly desperate penguin sound. Those sounds are more like some animal at slaughter than a human. Oh God, how I wanted so badly to help her, but what could I do? What could I have done? I was a child. We were all only children, and none of us were ready to see something like that. Here, we were supposed to be protected. The class was all a frenzy of screams, tears, and freshly fallen blood. The next thing I remember, other sisters had rushed into the room, pulling the girl whose lower half was destroyed out of her mouth and heaving Sister Claire back, like guards capturing an escaped lunatic. They ripped up some fragment of her clothes, exposing her stomach. The skin was mottled blue and punctured in 1,000 places as if the slow spreading from many poisonous bites. Took all of them to drag her back, and she laughed in a deep and evil voice, and the girl I had known, the girl who had so tentatively raised her hand and asked, Sister, lay in the blood-soaked floor, eyes unblinking. All the children were arranged to be sent away to a surviving convent in the countryside. If anyone asked what had happened to Sister Claire, or what had happened in that room on that day, the other sisters said only, I'm sorry, but Sister Claire is unwell right now. They had determined, through a later study of her effects, her books and notes, that she had done something truly perverted, something no one human was ever meant to. The Mother Superior once began to tell me that she had looked directly into something, but she never finished. I said before that she had no flaws, perhaps in prescience of the rule I gave her one, and that was pride in her own goodness, or else her Christian care for the world, too great to be tenable. The world had gone to hell, and somehow she had tried to absorb all the evils of it unto herself. She had drawn, as one draws a poison, the whole of humanity, misery, and the whole of human sin out of the world into herself as her own crucificial sacrifice. She had her last martyrdom, and it had destroyed her. I went back to see her once. So great was my filial love for my Sister Claire that even then I could not leave her there. I could not abandon her. The Mother Superior had written to me to say that I might see her if I could follow their strict instructions in interacting with her. I was escorted into one of the brick and concrete halls I had once walked, and beneath the dim lighting of far-spaced chandeliers, the Mother Superior gave strict instructions on behavior. I was not to look at her, and I was not to listen to her should she begin whispering. For I think one young and inexperienced sister had allowed her to plant something in her brain through one of her whispers, and she had departed crying. She had been found later in her room, having hung herself. Then, with a final warning, I was escorted into the room with Mother Superior beside me. She had warned, not these words,
"If you keep these instructions, I don't think you will find anything harmful, but it will, I'm afraid, be very upsetting to you."
I could not see her, but a light was behind her, and her shadow cast where we sat. A shadow of a perfectly ordinary woman bound to a chair. And now it is strange, for I remember the room smelling two ways. First, virulently of Lemure's cage, blood, disease, vomit, and death all at once. And yet second, as rose, pure as cookies, sweet. And her voice was sweet when she spoke, asking me in familiar tones. But to look at her, she was fine. It was a terrible thing she had done, terrible, and she would pray to God every day for forgiveness. But she wasn't sick anymore.
"I'm better now."
Only the sisters wouldn't believe her. They had locked her up here. I must help her. Only look at her and be contented that what she said was true. And by God, I wanted to look at her. I wanted to so badly I wanted to believe her. But then a cold hand was firmly on the back of my head, and Mother Superior was forcing my head down. "Look at me," the thing that had been Sister Claire said in her honeyed voice. Then, when she realized I would not look at her, her shadow changed. It grew larger, more animal, and she began growling like some predator, a tiger or a leopard. I cried. I'm sure I did. And then she began whispering, and the sound filled the room like a buzzing of a thick swarm of wasps. I covered my ears with my hands and wept as I heard through the muffling the indistinct whisperings of a fallen angel. Did I say anything to her? Perhaps I begged for forgiveness for not doing more to prevent her from this path. That sad, scared look, how I remember it even now. Perhaps, in sympathy, I only said that I was sorry. I don't remember. The last thing I do remember was that we made it out of that room. I think we cleansed ourselves in holy water, and I was escorted away. Outside, the sky was still a warning red, and screams and sirens still lived in the air. But for her, she was to remain bound tightly and locked within the confines of that little room for the rest of her days. All contact with the outside world mediated under only the strictest of terms and the closest of scrutiny, and guards placed of the very holiest order to keep her there. And we didn't know if it would be enough. We didn't even know if ultimately we would all become infected like her. We knew only that she had forsaken her humility and taken all of the world's evil into herself. We knew only that she had sacrificed herself as a cloth to soak up the blood gushing forth from the gaping wound of the world. So why did the world still grow darker? Can an explorer ever truly escape the darkness that swallows them? His greatest fear was always the inability to breathe. As he descends into suffocating darkness, the earth embraces him, and his existence grows smaller. The walls close in, pinning his arms, squeezing. In the darkest parts of man's subconscious lies the understanding that existence is two-phased. What most don't recognize is the space between being and not. Between the spaces of life exists a world where the veil has been skewed to the point of dissolution. Every time that something goes bump in the night, every movement in the corners of your peripheral vision, this is where the separation is weakened enough to allow passage. My greatest fear was always the inability to breathe, whether it be drowning, being buried alive, or general claustrophobia. The simple thought would send shivers down my spine. When I made the life choices I did, I never imagined they'd take me to the places I dread when the lights go off. As a chemical engineer, part of my job is understanding and regulating the risks of certain agents. Whether it's a bioweapon or a gas leak, one of the individuals with the same resume as me would be dispatched to handle the situation safely and effectively. That day was supposed to be a simple process and clear operation in a small mining town, the Connecticut mines, where a relic of the gold rush that ended in a copper baron bleeding the land of its beauty and resources. The nearby community, following the abandonment of the mines, have now come to realize the benefits of the National Park Service converting an eyesore into a monument to man's greed. The considered kids will be kids. When my phone rang with the assignment, all I was told was that there had been a weird gas leak in a small Alaskan town. Unfortunately, we don't often have a lot of information because it's not important until we hit the ground. My plane tickets took me to McCarthy, and the local police were extremely hospitable. They helped me get checked into my lodging and gave me the rundown of the area. I attempted to ask some questions about the situation, but all I got was boilerplate response about ongoing investigations and that I'd have to talk to the incident commander. The next morning, I arrived at the base of the mountain and met with the police blockade. Sergeant Jackson stepped out of the crowd and introduced himself as the on-site commander and my liaison. All he was able to give me was that 2 kids had gone into the mine and were missing. When his officers attempted to respond, they suffered headaches and retreated to establish a cordon per department policy. They were reporting methane poisoning symptoms, but stated that it felt different. We went over the area layout and potential hazards before he approved me to go to work. As I donned my SCBA, I had to quell my panic. No matter how many times I test my airflow, the fear of equipment failure sits at the back of my mind. Panic attack was put on the back burner as I ascended the mountain. Throughout my time as an engineer, I've met many challenges. My first year, I received word of a potential anthrax. When I arrived, the woman that reported it was scared beyond belief. She recalled the fear from the Marathax attacks of 2001 and thought that Al-Qaeda had decided to take out small town of Illinois. The powder was nothing more than paper dust for manufacturing, but the fear in her voice may never go away. I was never trained to counsel, but in this woman I saw my mother and my grandmother. Everyone has fear, and unfortunately, sometimes we are forced to face them in the real world. Though I may never know how her psyche fared in the following days, I took solace in the fact that I was able to help her by bringing the threat down to a digestible level. As I approached the mine entrance, my handheld probe screamed to life. The warning that came from this baton on my belt was overshadowed by the beauty of the area. Across the wooden beam that denoted this mine as the property of the company that poisoned the land was a collection of carvings. These markings, even to an untrained eye like mine, depicted the dangers of the earth's wound and the ramifications of losing the respect for the natural order. Despite everything telling me not to, I recorded the probe's readings and stepped into the abyss. The darkness has long been a point of fear for man. In the days of Neanderthal, the darkness housed predators and unknown dangers. Man developed a sense of safety around fire and sources of light. The ring of warmth from the flame provided a sense of control over one's environment. The suffocating darkness of the mine robbed me of any control I felt that I had. As I progressed amongst the remnants of the miners and the apparent lost souls that squatted here during their times of discovery, the earth seemed to embrace me as a part of her eternal being. My existence became less and less consequential the further I walked. As the space grew smaller, so did I. I came to a point where I was no longer able to stand. I pulled out my probe and attempted to take a reading, in the hopes I would not have to proceed. Unfortunately, the source of whatever I was looking for seemed to be beyond this choke point. On my hands and knees, I continued. Every time my head or back scraped against the rock of the cavern, I was reminded of the situation that I found myself in. Never in the lectures I attended or the assignments I've been on had I ever been in such a predicament. At the end of a corridor that seemed to stretch for miles, the room opened back up. I cleaned the dust off my mask and was met with a corridor of lanterns. Not lights, not glow sticks, but lit kerosene lanterns. Fire has not been used in mining for years, simply because of the risk of gas, where any canary would simply expire in a methane-rich environment. The fire would either extinguish or ignite. Many a soul had been lost to a flash fire or an explosion that ended in a collapse. The presence of these lanterns stopped me in my tracks. The mind had filled the gaps left by man's indiscretion. Against my better judgment, I removed my mask and took a cautionary breath. When my throat didn't close from gas exposure, I let myself relax. At the end of the expanse, the lantern seemed to die off as the abyss reclaimed the light. I continued down the passage, and the walls seemed to close in with the light. Before I knew it, I was surrounded by rock on all sides. I turned to my right and continued shimmying despite my growing inner protest. My air tank obstructed my way, so I removed it and tossed it by the wayside. This gave me room to breathe and pause. The last bits of sanity that lived within me told me to turn around. It told me to run away from here. Those missing boys be damned. Despite everything I knew, I continued. Eventually, the opening was my exact size. My arms were pinned in position, and every inhale pressed my ribs against the rock. Thankfully, my head was looking to the right, so the loss of mobility wasn't as apparent. I would inhale and move forward, inhale and step. I did this until I couldn't fill my lungs anymore. As my breathing grew shallow, I heard something down the way, a small voice pleading for me to continue. So I did. Every step, my breathing got shallower. Before I knew it, I was sipping the air like a man lost in the desert that found a drop of morning dew. I took the deepest drink that I could and took one final step. The wall squeezed out the last bits of air that I possessed and froze. When someone drowns, there's a reported feeling of euphoria. The moment that the ocean claims you as a part of the food chain, you lose all worldly worries and sink into eternity. Life is full of stress and things to focus on. The moments without anything release dopamine into the brain to ease the pains of death. I didn't get to experience that feeling. I remember every moment that I sat there wishing I could gasp for air. I felt my mouth dry out and my lungs burn. If I'd had the ability, I would have screamed into the abyss where I'd spent my last moments. When the fire in my chest got to be too much, I passed out. I was never a religious man as a child, so a stained glass depiction of the crucifixion gave me nightmares. I would dream that I was carrying the cross and being whipped. I would dream that I was on the hill watching it happen. I would dream that I was Longinus with my spear, sealing my fate. Maybe the fear was of hell. Maybe the fear was of death. Despite my objections, my mother made sure that every week I was there in the third row listening to the preacher talk brimstone and fire. In college, I read of the circles of hell and the punishments that awaited the sinners. Never did Dante mention being swallowed by the earth. What would a piano sound like if it was played by the dead? Pale as death and drowned in crimson, she dances behind glowing windows. Her manic laughter carries on the wind until one night the music stops and silence brings the stench of decay. But the piano plays again, wild and foreboding, draining life from the sleepless villagers below. As a fog creeps up the hill and flames fail to silence the instrument, something emerges from the shadows, claiming fingers and souls. Join the community for more stories. Lady Vermella's piano was large and black. It was covered in a thick, feathery layer of dust. Its keys were turning yellow. It pounded out a strange, haunting melody every night under Lady Vermella's fingers. Lady Vermella lived in an ancient manor on the top of a hill above the town of East Wellington. Her manor was hung high with rigid shadows and snaking with dark, leafy ivy. It stood there for too long, and now its foundation was giving way, and it was starting to crumble and sink back into the ground. Lady Vermella herself was as pale as death and fascinated by the color red. Red velvet carpets covered her floors, burgundy curtains cloaked the house in shadow, crimson gowns overflowed from her drawers. She bathed, lavished, and drowned in a sea of red, and she never ever saw daylight. The manor stood with the town far below it, so the villagers never set eyes on Lady Vermella. Occasionally, when a dark, dark night dawned and her windows glowed in the distance, they would see a silhouette dancing behind the glass panes. The figure twirled and bent and threw back its head and laughed a long, manic laugh that carried all the way down to the villagers. And then the piano playing would begin, deep and dark and thrilling. It echoed down the hill and pounded in every street. The melody danced wildly up and down, going faster and faster, before fading out with a final drown-out note. The last note was like a dying breath, leaving the streets silent and drained of life. Life is a fickle thing. Even Lady Vermella's garish sea of red couldn't save her from the fickleness of life. One night, after the piano's music had bloomed like a dark rose over the town, Lady Vermella went to sleep. She closed her dark, sunken eyes, sank down into her scarlet sheets, and never woke up. The following night, the piano was silent. Dust gathered on its keys, shifting and settling every time a frail wind blew through the cracks in the window panes. Night after night passed, bringing its unsettling, almost alien silence. Finally, the stench began to waft into town. It was the stench of decayed flesh, ghastly and bitter. The villagers couldn't focus, couldn't go about their work, with the smell accusing them of not caring about Lady Vermella. A brave group of men assembled. They trudged up the hill, bashed open the manor's doors, and carried Lady Vermella's body from the house. Her eyes had slipped partly open, and they tried to ignore the grey maggots squirming beneath her lids. Her fingers were curled into stiff claws, as if still striking the piano's keys. Around one gleamed a golden ring, the ruby inlaid in its center glistening like a drop of blood. They dug a hole behind the ancient manor, threw her in and buried her. Lady Vermella became nothing but a sad mound of dirt. Perhaps they should have said a prayer or left a flower, a crimson-petaled flower, at her grave, but they did not. The men returned home. They ate dinner and recounted the horror of death to their families. Afterwards, they went to bed. As the night deepened and even the stars left the sky, sleep began to steal over them. Then the first low, melancholy note sounded. It came from far up on the hill, floating through the broken door of the manor. It was followed by another, and then another, pulsing, rising, and beginning to pound through the night like a wild tune. If any of the villagers hadn't been too frozen in their beds to get up and look, they would have seen the light flick on in one of the manor's windows and glow in the distance. The piano played night after night, making the leaves tremble on the trees and gliding through every street with a sense of foreboding. The villagers could not sleep. They became pale and gaunt, with eyes as dark and sunken as Lady Vermella's. Eventually, they all reached the same conclusion without it ever being voiced. Something must be done. Something was done. The villagers convinced Lady Vermella's cousin, who had inherited the manor but lived abroad, to sell it. It wasn't a completely clean or honest sale. The villagers fixed the front doors and neglected to mention that Lady Vermella was buried right outside, and that piano played a low, ominous tune every night. The unfortunate buyers were a young couple with fresh, bright faces and a general ever-present cheer that aggravated the villagers. Still, the villagers hoped their presence would put an end to the ominous tunes and sleepless nights. On their first evening at the manor, the couple's dinner was interrupted by a soft creaking sound. Sarah left her husband at the table and followed the sound. She had climbed several flights of stairs and was walking down a dark, narrow hallway when she found the source. It was a small wooden door, most likely that of a closet. The door was creaking and rattling gently as if being pushed from the inside. Sarah stood in front of it for a moment. She didn't like the feeling it gave her. A chilled feeling. The doorknob glinted as if it had just been turned a fraction of an inch. She stared at it hard. It was dull and still. The chilled feeling inside her grew. To do away with the unpleasant sensation, she took the doorknob in her hand. It was icy cold, as if someone had just breathed a frosty breath over it. Sarah twisted and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, she realized, and she didn't know where the key was. Harry noticed his wife was a little pale, her eyes a little darting, when she returned to the dinner table. But he had already finished eating, and he had work to do. So he retired to his study and spent the rest of the evening with his paperwork instead of his wife. Sarah cleaned up the table, closed the lid of the piano, made sure all the doors were locked, and turned off the lights in the manor one by one. Finally, she went to bed. Alone in the dark, she lay awake. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking. The sound traveled softly through each room, carefully counting each passing second. After several hours, she heard the tread of her husband's footsteps coming down the hallway and entering the bedroom. "Blasted paperwork," he grumbled as he climbed into bed. Soon, they both sank into a dreamless sleep. Morning dawned, and their sleep dissipated into the sunlight and far-off lilt of birdsong. Harry lay in bed as his wife rummaged around in their wardrobe. He squinted at the ceiling and then held up his hand. "Darling, do you hear something?" Sarah went very still and held her breath. She listened for the soft creak of the closet door whispering down the hallway, but all she heard was silence. "I don't hear anything," she said finally. "Exactly," Harry replied. "Where's the ticking of that old clock? I heard it the entire time I was in my study last night." Sarah frowned. "Lady Vermilla didn't take care of anything here. Must have worn out and broken while we were asleep." Harry simply sighed and shook his head. "I'll search around and find it," Sarah added. "You can fix it, can't you?" "I mean, if you want me to," he replied. "I'm not sure if it's worth it, but if you want." Later that day, Sarah walked through every dark hallway and searched every room, all drowning in vivid scarlet furnishings, but she didn't find the clock. Eventually, as if drawn by an invisible string all along, she found herself in front of the locked room. She felt the chill rising up in her as she realized the only place the clock could be was behind the door. At dinner, Harry asked if she'd found the broken clock. She shook her head. "I think it's in a locked closet," he added. I see. By the way, darling, I've been wanting to ask you, did you play the piano?" "Of course not. Why would you ask?" Sarah said with surprise. "I was just wondering why it was open. It was closed last night, wasn't it?" "Of course. I was the one who closed it." "Well then, I was just wondering why you opened it again." "I didn't," Sarah said. She felt shaky as she stood and walked to the adjacent room, where the piano resided. Its lid was flung back, revealing the yellowing keys. The layer of dust on its lid and bench had thickened, but the keys were swept clean. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, and she walked up to Lady Vermilla's piano and snapped the lid closed. "There," she said to herself. "There." As she lay in bed that night, waiting for her husband to emerge from his study, she stared up at the ceiling and tried not to think. Distantly, she could hear the closet door rattling gently on its hinges. Moonlight fell through the half-closed crimson drapes. She began to slip into sleep, but then a soft whirring sound dragged her back to consciousness. The whirring ended with a click, followed by the steady tick-tock, tick-tock of a clock. The clock's ticking was still creeping through the room when Harry came from his study.
"The clock restarted,"
Sarah said softly, staring up at the ceiling. "I know," he responded. He didn't say. "That's good," like she had hoped he would. The next morning, Sarah was pale and drawn. Harry woke to find her standing in front of the mirror, touching the deep purple shiners under her eyes.
"I could hardly sleep last night,"
she said, without turning around.
"Every time I did, I dreamed about that awful piano playing."
"It's only a dream, darling," Harry said soothingly. "It's the stress of moving into a new house that's getting to you. You just need some time to adjust." He sat up and began feeling under the bed for his slippers. "What time is it?" He paused, cocking his head, and then said, "Well, I'll be darned. That old clock has stopped again." Sarah went downstairs to fix herself some tea, at Harry's recommendation. Her footsteps had barely faded on the stairs when he heard her screaming his name. He rushed downstairs, half-dressed and still in his slippers. "For goodness sake, Sarah, where are you?" he shouted, running into the kitchen and then back out when he found it empty. Entering the room adjacent to the dining hall, he found her standing by Lady Vermilla's piano. The lid was thrown back, and the keys were gleaming like yellowed teeth. "Sarah, what in the world is going on?" Harry said. She held very rigid and still, her back to him.
"It was you playing the piano last night, wasn't it?"
"What?"
"I wasn't dreaming. You were the one playing that ghastly song."
"I haven't touched this piano."
"Then why is the lid open again? I closed it last night. I know I closed it last night."
When she turned to look at him, there was a strange expression on his face. The odd gleam faded from his eyes just as quickly as she'd glimpsed it, before she could tell if it was real or imagined. Harry ran both his hands through his hair. "I don't know why the lid is open again, but it wasn't me. I've just about had enough of this piano. I'm getting rid of it today." Her eyes were wide.
"Rid of it? Who are you going to sell it to?"
"I'll donate it. Who wouldn't want an expensive antique like this for free?"
"Everyone. I think everyone in this town knows it belongs to Lady Vermilla. They're not going to want it."
"Then I'll destroy it." Harry went back upstairs to get dressed. When he came down, he was lugging a can of gasoline and a box of matches from one of the storage closets. It took some heavy lifting and quite a bit of maneuvering, but they managed to carry the piano outside.
"There,"
Sarah said, pointing at a patch of bare ground behind the house. They set it down, and the piano's legs sank deep into the moist soil. The earthly stench filled Sarah's nose. Harry tilted his head upward. "It looks like it may rain soon. Let's make this quick." Dark clouds were turning overhead, gathering in the sky and casting the town in a thin veil of shadow. Looking down, Sarah saw thick coils of fog cloaking the rooftops and swirling around the base of the hill. There wasn't enough sunlight to lift the fog, and now it was rising, creeping up towards the manor in long, spidery white tendrils. The piano's shiny black lid, though coated in dust, still reflected the thin, pale fissures of light breaking through the clouds. Surrounded by grass and dirt, the instrument looked starkly out of place and magnificently grand. Harry doused it in gasoline and lit a match. The glowing flame flickered as he dropped it onto the piano and stepped back. For a moment it continued to feebly gasp for life, then it touched the slick sheen of gas dripping off the piano's black wood, and it rose in a sudden swell of light. The piano was engulfed in flame. The fire danced eerily, reaching out for the darkened sky, the air filled with smoke and the sharp smell of burning wood and paint. Harry watched it for a moment, his eyes glinting with the wavering flames. Then he turned to his wife. I'll take care of the fire once the piano's burned. You can go inside and make yourself tea. Sarah obeyed. The day passed in pounding rain and rising fog. Sarah went out once to look at the charred remains of the piano. Its ivory keys were unscathed, gleaming among the charcoal splinters of wood and ash like teeth. That night, she didn't have the spirit to fix a nice meal, so dinner consisted of cold leftover ham eaten with white rice. Harry didn't say anything when he saw the meager spread. Maybe he was feeling the same depressive heaviness in his limbs. He looked disturbingly pale, sunken deep in thought, hooded in shadow. His eyes were darkened and unreadable. "This weather," he muttered once under his breath, and Sarah agreed. Before bed, Sarah lifted the heavy crimson drapes over one of the manor's windows and peered outside. The fog had reached the manor, engulfing it. Pale tendrils glided past her window, pressing against it as if trying to come inside. The only thing she could see through the impenetrable white sea were the ragged silhouettes of trees looming up towards the moon. For a moment, through the smothering curtain of white, she thought she glimpsed a dark shadow moving between the trees, but then the fog misted her window pane like someone blowing a cold breath onto the glass, obscuring her view. The heaviness in her limbs had become oppressive. She moved lethargically as she made her way upstairs. She passed her husband's study and saw a light seeping through the crack under his closed door. The faint sound of papers being rustled came from inside. The soft scratching of a pen followed her down the hallway. Sarah lay awake in bed late into the night. She stared up at the ceiling, waiting, and blinked slowly. Finally, Harry's dragging footsteps came down the hall. He didn't close the bedroom door behind him, which she thought was a mistake. Although her eyes never left the ceiling, she could feel the darkness creeping into the room through the open door. "Sarah, are you still awake?" Harry whispered as he lay down beside her. A damp, earthly scent trickled through the dark. Sarah didn't answer, but she kept her eyes open wide and unblinking. "Sarah? Close the door." "Why?" he asked. Then he went suddenly still beside her. A soft, whirring sound was coming from somewhere in the manor, followed by a mechanical click, and then the steady tick-tock, tick-tock of the clock restarting. "I wish it wouldn't do that," Sarah whispered. "I hate that clock." "Shh," Harry said sharply. He sat up, the sheets rustling around him, the smell of damp dirt growing stronger. A creak echoed down the hallway, followed by the gentle rattling of the closet door on its hinges. Then, silence. The darkness pouring out of the hallway was suffocating. Sarah felt her breathing coming shallow. Without a word, she crept out of bed and down a corridor. She passed several stagnant rooms, their doors half open and glints of moonlight falling through their curtains, glowing on the red velvet upholstery and scarlet carpets. The ticking of the clock followed her. She made several turns, walking deeper into the manor. She was chilled to her very bones, her heart racing in her icy chest. Her footsteps were muted as her bare feet sank into the carpet lining the narrow, shadowy hallway. The ticking was growing steadily louder. There were no windows here, and the darkness was all-consuming, smothering. At the end of the hallway, she stopped moving. She simply could not remember how to move. The closet door was swinging lazily on its hinges, hanging wide open, the metal of its knob glinting in the darkness with every swaying movement. She couldn't make out what was inside, just a deep pit of blackness. Chilly air was gliding out of the blackness and enveloping her. It was at that moment that she realized the clock had died. Silence crawled through the shadows near her ears. Their time had run out. She turned slowly, horror and dread filling her throat. The narrow hallway unfolded before her, empty but for the dark, unsmoothing shadow of the carpet. She began to run before the fear whirling in her head told her to. The rooms flashed by in glints of pale moonlight and gleams of bloody red. She stumbled around one corner and then the next, only next scraping breaths and frantic, muffled footsteps filled her ears. Finally, she reached the bedroom. The door was closed. "Henry!" she screamed. "Open up! Open up right now!" There was no reply. Gasping for breath, she seized the doorknob and shook the door violently. It rattled on its hinges. She became aware that the metal was icy cold in her hand. A soft metallic click resonated from the other side of the door. Then the knob began to turn in her hand as it was opened from the other side. "Harry?" Faintly. Either somewhere in the manor or somewhere in her head, she thought she heard the sound of Lady Vermella's piano pounding out a dark, haunting melody. The villagers of East Wellington slept well that night, despite the fog pressing in on their houses, swirling against their window panes and creeping under their doors. They slept so well that not one of them woke up in the middle of the night. Not one of them heard a scream. Over the next few days, a strange scent began to waft into the town, bitter and decayed, the scent of death. A small group of brave men once again assembled and trudged up the hill to the manor. The mist had begun to clear and was now only a thin veil. They circled the manor, passing the patch of freshly churned dirt where they had buried Lady Vermella. Tendrils of fog seeped over the grave. Not a shred of grass had sprung up and begun to cover it. They approached the manor's great doors and banged on them. No one answered. "Never mind," said one man, pushing the doors open. "They're unlocked." Inside, the stench was sickening. Two men clomped upstairs, breathing shallowly. The first man walked through the maze of hallways but found nothing. He encountered the second man standing in front of a closed bedroom door. "I found them," the second man said in a low, shaking voice. "They're in the room. They're dead, both of them, and they're missing their fingers." "Missing their fingers?" the first man said in a puzzled voice. "Go on." "They were chopped half off. You don't want to see. It's messy. I found this on one of the woman's stumps. Did you find anything?" The first man shook his head. He had seen nothing but narrow hallways and an empty closet. "What is it?" He stared at what the other man held out. It was a golden ring, set with a glittering blood-red ruby.
I'm so glad you were able to make it to the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. You could be the one that sends the channel to the moon. Don't miss the next grand adventure. So always tune in next time. Have a good one.